2023, the year of ESOG. Now, I thought about this title and I thought I've really missed a trick here. I should have had some big alien monster on the slide, but sadly I'm not here to talk about the inside track on the Doctor Who Christmas special, but something marginally less interesting, arguably more important, but certainly more long-winded, which is the regulator's single code of practice. So that's me. What are we going to cover? Well, I'm going to give a bit of a recap as to how we got here, because it's been quite a long-winded process, and then cover what the law says and what the code is designed to cover, and then what you need to do. So I think it's something, in a nutshell, that all trustees should be having on their business plan for next year. So how do we get here? Quite a long route map there. It all stems from 8 years ago now, 2014, the IOP directive. That's a European directive, but it's already in UK law, so no bonfire, unfortunately. So what we've got is we had an amendment to the Pensions Act 2004, then some regulations which came into force in January 2019. And the 2019 regulations basically set the framework for what the government wants the regulator to do in the single code. Then we had a draft single code in May 2021, consultation for 3 months, then silence for 15 months, and now we're expecting the final code to be, to land either December this year or early next year. So that's the timetable, so quite a drawn-out process. Now, what does the single code do? Well, I think it's a change of emphasis. It legalises governance more so than governance was legalised before. I think, in a nutshell, that's what it does. Before the single code, governance is split, really, between codes of practice, what the regulator considers to be best practice for schemes to do, and also certain requirements in law, such as your MNTs, your IDRP, your internal controls, of course, and also your trust law type decision-making, appointment processes, and that sort of thing. After the single code, what the law has done, the Pension Schemes Act, the Pensions Act 2004 amendment, has basically shifted into law the requirement to have an effective system of governance. So that is now a legal requirement in addition to having internal controls. So what does the law say? Well, this is the key provision of the Pensions Act 2004. So trustees must establish and operate an effective system of governance, including internal controls. So that's the addition there, the effective system of governance. That's been slotted in. It used to just say internal controls. Now, the system must be proportionate to the size, nature, scale and complexity of the activities of the scheme. So we're not talking about a one-size-fits-all set of governance requirements. We're talking about a whole set of expectations on top of strict legal requirements, and trustees need to exercise judgment as to what is right for their scheme. So quite a difficult one. Now, the requirements are not set out in the Pensions Act 2004 themselves. That simply sets out effective system of governance. So that begs the question, what is it? The regulations, 2018 regulations, set out the framework for what the government wants the regulator to include in the single code. So the regulations are about 2 pages long, simply a set of headings, and what it says is, you, Mr. Regulator, must create a code of practice which covers all these headings. And then we're currently working with the draft single code, which is 150 pages long, 51 modules, 33 of which relate to the effective system of governance, and the rest sort of the existing legal requirements and what we do already, basically. So the regulations put more requirements for the code on larger schemes. But when I say larger, I mean those with 100 or more members. Well, you rarely come across those with fewer than 100 members, do you? So, I expect most schemes that we come across will have to look at the whole aspect of the single code. But if you are one of those schemes with fewer than 100 members, these are the headings that you will need to look for in the single code, basically. This is what the regulations say the code must cover for you. So it's just one little flower. And I'm not expecting anyone to read that, but you'll have the slides afterwards. But you'll see there's, what's that? That's seven little petals on there. If you've got 100 or more members, you have to do those 7 and all these as well. So a further 6 petals there of additional requirements, focused more on having written policies and more granular requirements for having processes, which we'll have a look in more detail in a moment. And you've got to do an own risk assessment, which is once you've covered all your petals in your effective system of governance, you've got to conduct an own risk assessment of how well you're doing, how effective it is, now the draft code said after 12 months, after the code comes into force, but the regulations themselves have a slightly longer timescale, so we're hoping that will be clarified when the final code is issued. But before you can do your ORA, your own risk assessment, you've got to have your effective system of governance in place. So I think the plan for 2023 is develop or continue to develop your effective system of governance, and then the next stage will be to review it all and check its effectiveness. So what does the draft single code say? Well, 51 modules, 51 modules covering 10 existing codes of practice. There will be further modules added into it to cover further codes of practice when the regulator gets round to it. 33 of the modules relate to ESOG. They all cross-refer to each other, so it can be a little bit hard to follow through all the requirements in a particular area from the actual code itself. 151 pages. Broadly speaking, covering 6 key areas for your effective system of governance. So you're looking at how you organise yourselves, how you take decisions, who takes those decisions, how you appoint them, how you administer the scheme, how you communicate with members, investment issues, and how you review what you're doing, basically. Regular internal review is a prevailing theme throughout the draft single code. So what the regulator wants you to do is to develop processes and procedures in particular areas, and then to keep organically reviewing those to make sure that they're working as they should. And internal controls, which we're all used to already, but that's all sort of locked into the single code as well. So, a lot of things to do in terms of the single code, but how do you work out what you need, how you need to approach it in terms of proportionality? What is the standard which the regulator is expecting you to get to? Well, the single code doesn't really give you a great deal of help. It has a few quotes, but it doesn't sort of set a particular standard for a particular size of scheme. What it helpfully explains is that it's not prescriptive about the methods, that you don't necessarily need to comply with everything in the code, but you need to demonstrate that you've thought about what's important for the nature of your scheme, and you need to use your judgment. So, the expectations, they're hoping, should prompt discussion and consideration of the processes and policies, an assessment of whether they exist and are functioning as intended, but you have some freedom to choose and prioritise specific measures above others. And it may be because some are more urgent or important. So, what should you be looking at? Well, I think all we can do is go back to the Act, and it says proportionate by reference to the size, scale, nature and complexity of your scheme. So I think a sort of key sort of starting point when you come to tackle the single code is to really understand what type of scheme you've got. I mean, size is important, but it's not just size of members, number of members. It's also, assets, how big your trustee board is, how many employers you have, how big those employers are potentially, what sort of benefit structure does it have, how are you invested, Is it contracted out or contracted in? You know, what type of employer do you have, and is it closed to accrual? Do you have a professional trustee? You know, these are all things which sort of explain its nature. And scale. What type of systems and efficiencies do you have, or expert experience do you have access to? The employer covenant might be relevant to that. But I think, you know, the key here is that the bigger the scheme, the more evidence you will have to show that you've got a comprehensive system of governance in all the areas you need to cover. Complexity. Well, again, that sort of relates to number of benefit categories, perhaps, accrual rates, different rates of interest or revaluation, different tranches. You know, there's lots of issues there. The more you've got to go wrong in your scheme and your administration and management, the more comprehensive your system of governance will need to be. So these are all things which you need to think about. And once you've done that, and we'll have a look at how trustees can approach evidencing and getting to the stage of being able to sort of document their ESOG in a moment. But the the own risk assessment here, when you've got 100 or more members, it has to review certain other things as well. That's also proportionate to the size, nature and complexity of the scheme. Basic requirements are to ensure the effectiveness of your ESOG, and you've got to look at all these things. So the policies you set up to reflect the aspects of the single code in terms of, you know, appointment and resignation of trustees, etc., you need to review how they're working. You need to have a look at your risk management policies and see how they're working. And you need to look at your investment governance processes to see whether they're effective, your administration, and your payment of benefits. So that's something for 2024, but as you can see, it's not a short-term process. It can be quite involved. Not a tick box exercise. You have to sort of be able to document and do the process and disclose to the regulator what you have done at the end of that process as well. You don't have to supply it unless they ask, but you need to have it if they do. So what should we be doing? Well, I think understanding what you need to do and the nature of your scheme is the first step. So how many members do you have? How many of those petals do you have to comply with? Are you focusing primarily on the organisation and management of your trustee board and your appointment and resignation processes? Or are you having to go into much more granular detail as a larger scheme and devise written policies in terms of outsourcing for your providers, your advisors, your service, everyone who services the scheme? Do you need to have the remuneration policies? Do you need an investment governance process? There's various extra additional policies you are likely to need. And first of all, you need to audit what you're currently doing. You need to be able to identify what you are currently doing well, where you comply, where you need to review what you're currently doing to make sure it reflects what the single code is telling you about, and you need to work out where you're not currently doing what the single code expects you to have, and you need to work out whether you think your scheme is of a nature where you should be doing that, and then how you evidence that you're doing that. So it's a gap analysis process, really, to assess where you are now and work out where you need to get to and how much detail you need to put in to the governance processes you produce. So it's a matter of evidence. You need to demonstrate that you do have this governance process. I think all too often now, the trustee rules, for example, will set out how you appoint a trustee. And schemes will have a member-nominated trustee policy, perhaps, which sets out the strict legal requirements of what you must do and which you cannot derogate from because they've been in law for well, decades, haven't they? What your ESOG will do is wrap some process around that. How do you appoint trustees? Who should be a trustee? Have you thought about diversity on your trustee board? Have you thought about succession planning on your trustee board? How do you approach the pool of trustees? How does the employer appoint trustees? So it's looking for you to sort of future-proof and improve the management of the scheme by identifying what skills you need and by documenting the process you'll go through to make sure you get the right people on the board, for example. Similarly, what is the process that will follow if a trustee suddenly resigns? You know, what are your continuity plans? How do you go about getting a new trustee appointment? Having a policy which sort of sets out the framework is the sort of thing the regulator is expecting you to do under the single code. Similarly, for advisors, do you just appoint someone you met at a seminar, or do you go through a sort of outsourcing process and get tenders for your advisors? The single code sort of sets out expectations for trustees to basically be more business-like and commercial in certain areas in terms of how you appoint your advisors and managers to the scheme and how you monitor their performance and address things which need addressing. And having a process which sets out what you as trustees need to do to demonstrate that you're aware of how often you review performance, how often you tender for advisors, how often you review the effectiveness of the trustee board, acts as a prompt and acts as evidence that you've thought about it and that you're actually, this is how you run your scheme to make sure it's effective. And the whole purpose of the aura then is for you to revisit those policies and make sure, well, we said we'd do that in this scenario. Have we done it? Is there anything else that we're missing? Has that worked particularly well? What hasn't worked well? And then for you to adjust your process for a sort of program, if you like, of continual improvement of governance. That's what this is all aimed to do. Having some kind of ESOG compliance and review policy is an excellent way of sort of trying to bring it all together, I think. Somehow you've got to be able to demonstrate that you're covering the area, you've identified the areas you need to cover, that you've thought about how much detail you need to go into in all of the areas which are applicable for your scheme. You've thought about what is proportionate in these areas, and you've thought about when you're going to review each element of your governance as well. And wrapping that into some kind of process which says, this is how we trustees have approached this question, this is why we think our approach is proportionate, and this is when we're going to review it, because you may not want to review it all at once, in the sense that if you have a rolling programme, it's going to make your aura much easier, because then you don't suddenly have to sort of review absolutely everything relating to the scheme right at that point. If you have a rolling programme of review, then you do the aura audit, if you like, by the deadline that is set by the final code. So that's the sort of approach that you need to be thinking of. And how do you go about that? I mean, there's loads of approaches that you can go about that. Some trustees like to review their own internal policies and processes. Providers, may give you a checklist of what you can do. Do you have this? Do you have that? And you can work out whether you've got a gap or not, whether there's something you need to review or whether there's something that you need to develop and create. These are the sorts of things which we think you might need to think about. There's quite a lot there that you probably don't have already. Continuity plans. I imagine your administrators will have those, but does the scheme have a continuity plan if suddenly, the trustee meeting room blows up or something like that, or the employer is, if you rely on the employer for support, if suddenly the employer's hit with some kind of cyber attack or whatever, how will the scheme ensure that its business is able to continue and members can be paid? Do you have a member communications policy? The code goes into how you structure member communications, what medium you use to communicate with members. Do you use plain English? Do you have apps? Do you have website? All these things. It's not prescriptive, but it asks you to think about how should you be communicating with your members? And how do you make sure you disclose to them and give them the information that by law you have to give them? You know, that's like an internal control type issue, isn't it? But you can wrap it all into a policy saying, we know we have to give members this is how we're going to do it, this is how often we're going to review it, and we're going to, you know, potentially even, you know, speak to the members for their feedback. Let's work out how effective our communications actually are. That's all the sort of thing that you can think about in your policy and the sort of issues which the single code goes into. Policy for TKU and a training log. Well, most trustee boards have a training log. I went on this course. But is there an overarching policy which says this is what we expect trustees to do? This is how many hours we expect you to be putting in. This is the sort of, we'd like you to do the toolkit, please, within the first 6 months. You know, a policy which sets out expectations in that area would be, you know, would push some trustee boards to the next level. Not all, but some. Trustee appointments. We've talked about trustees generally, but what about the chair? Who appoints the chair? Are there any provisions in the rules about appointing the chair? Does the employer appoint the chair? Is he just, you know, is he there forever, or is he elected in each meeting? Well, you know, the policy invites you to work out what your rules say, what your current arrangements are, and whether they deserve a tweak. Terms of reference. You may have lots of subcommittees, but do you have formal terms of reference as to how far they can go, what they can do, what the extent of their authority is? Again, it's a matter of governance, and the single code invites you to document some of this stuff. Some of these policies your employer might be able to help you with, because the employer should have them. Anti-bribery and corruption. Not many trustee boards go into that so much. But technically speaking, you should be thinking about what sort of hospitality you can accept and, you know, issues around that. And the code mentions that. Cyber incident response policy, information security governance policy. We've had a bit of guidance on cyber from the regulator in the past few years, but the code goes into more detail as to the sort of expectations of trustees now. And they're sort of, you know, crucial policies, I would say, for most schemes now, for all schemes, ideally. Policy for the appointment of advisors and service providers. We've talked about that. You know, outsourcing and written policies is a requirement if you've got 100 or more members. Policy for planning, running and recording trustee meetings. You might not have anything like that at the moment, but the code sort of, you know, has a number of expectations as to how trustee meetings should be run. So are you reliant on your scheme rules? Are you reliant on your pensions manager, or sort of setting the framework and sending out the invitations? Or do you have a policy which sets out, this is how we're running trustee meetings, this is how often we meet, this is, you know, how we set the meeting, this is the agenda, this is how we record the meeting. It's to make sure you get a proper set of minutes and it's kept in the right place. What else we got? Remuneration policy, that's a good one. Again, directed at schemes with 100 or more members. How do you pay your independent trustees, your advisors and service providers? You know, how do you sort of think about remuneration and what's the right level? That generated a little bit of feedback on consultation, so we might see a few changes in the final code. But, you know, in principle, you know, it's a valid question, you know. So you can expect something to be in the code on that. What else am I going to pick out? Investment governance policy. I think in investment, we're all used to things like the SIP, the Statement of Funding Principles, and, you know, the ESG type issues. But how are investment decisions taken? When is advice sought? You know, well, how does the trustee go about sort of, you know, reviewing and considering investment issues? What do the scheme rules say about investment? Is there an investment subcommittee? How does it report to the main board? You know, having some kind of investment governance policy to pull it all together. This is, you know, this is how we deal with investment. This is our consultant. You know, this is how we monitor the performance of our funds, etc. You know, something to bring it all together. Sort of demonstrates you're sort of in control of everything and you know where all the parts are. And, you know, I think that is something which the code is keen on. And a lot of areas around risk and auditing your risks, sort of internal audits and assessments, particularly for the larger schemes. So that's a sort of flavour of the sort of things the single code are encouraging you to think about. So it sort of takes governance to the next level. And, you know, that's important because, you know, having an effective system of governance is now a legal requirement. And, you know, it's in law currently, but of course, until we have the final code, trustees have been able to put their hand up and say, it's all very well, but I don't really know what an effective system of governance is. But with the final code, we're all clear what the effective system of governance is, so then the regulator can start, you know, having a look and seeing what you're all doing. So it's important to have the evidence, and those who don't measure up are liable to get an improvement notice from the regulator saying, you're falling short in X, Y, and Z areas, sort it out, please, by this time, or further action will follow. That's the sort of approach we expect them to take. So quite a bit of work to do. Should definitely be on the agenda for 2023. I'm not allowed to sell, because Stuart will have my guts for garters. But if you can't face going through your processes, we have an online solution, which is very easy, so speak to me later. Right. Thank you. Any questions from anyone? Oh, yes.
Morning.
Morning.
What do you think the longer term effect of implementing this is going to be on the pensions market?
I think consolidation, increased consolidation. I think defined benefit schemes will, you know, we've just heard that they've got a fantastic window to buy out and wind up. And we're seeing that in the office, that more and more schemes are wanting to buy out and wind up, which is, you know, excellent for them and their members, of course. I think at the smaller level, I think, you know, those who have longer to go, I think, you know, it will be more of the same debate as to increase regulation, increase costs, you know, hastening the decline, etc. But, you know, if you can't get to buyout, which is the goal for all those schemes, and consolidation is not an option either, because, you know, that has its, you know, not available to all, then I think you're just going to have to, you'll have to do governance of, you'll have to improve your governance to an extent. It's getting the proportionality question right, isn't it? Because you don't want to overdo it and increase the costs on the employer and put more burden on the employer, but you have to be doing something. And I think then that is a question of get your priorities right, but it should see an improvement, I think, in the running of schemes. That's the aim. I think it should. Everything will just be a little bit tidier. You know, I'm less likely to get the question saying, oh, we've only got 2 trustees and our deed says 3. We've been running like this for 4 years. Is this okay? I mean, you know, because you'll expect schemes to preempt these things and have a plan to deal with them as and when they arise.